Hello and welcome to another video in the series Archaeology in Islam. My name is Dan Gibson and today we want to examine a subject that several viewers have asked about: pre-Islamic altars and sacrifice. As we saw in the last video, the people of Ad and the people of Thamud built altars on many of the high places in their country, and this is the situation we find in Petra. In addition to this, the various temples in Petra had altars and some sort of sacrifice took place there. In the previous video, I mentioned that various altars were built by Abraham and by Isaac. So how do altars and sacrifice fit into the religion of Abraham? How did the Jews, the descendants of Isaac, deal with this subject? Did Ishmael build altars? And did the Arabs build altars? And how do Christians deal with altars and sacrifice? And why don't we do this today? Did the need for altars and sacrifice stop? And if so, why? Lots of questions from lots of different people. So I thought I would take time and do one video and explore this topic. In the last video, we learned from the Quran that Ad and Thamud built high place altars. These high place altars can be found, as I said, all around Petra, and some are better preserved than others. Now first, there are several high places in ancient Sela. This is not Petra. I see lots of references that refer to Petra as if it was ancient Sela, but as I pointed out in an earlier video, there were two great rocks. Sela is the Hebrew word for rock, and Petra is the Greek word for rock. So the city of Petra was one of the ancient rocks. The other place was called Sela. It is the second rock. This is why the Romans called it the province of the two great rocks, Petria, Arabia. So, two Petras, two great rocks. Sela, the other great rock, and it is just north of Basra, the Edomite capital. And no, Petra was never the capital of the Edomites. I've seen that on some websites. Only Basra was the capital. It's about 60 kilometers north of Petra. So don't believe everything you read on the internet. I see many people making simple mistakes, and then they're quoted by others, and they're quoted by others, and soon everyone seems to be calling Petra Sela, and then they're saying, oh, it was the capital of the Edomites. Not true. These are wrong on both accounts. Petra was built after the Edomites. The Edomites took advantage when King Nebuchadnezzar II moved in, and he took the Israelites off into captivity. So the Edomites then took advantage and moved north into that territory. Now, here are the remains of the Edomite capital city, Basra, looking at it from across the Wadi. To the right of us, the valley drops down into Wadi Araba, down to the Dead Sea, which is the lowest spot on the face of the earth. Notice that this city has, all around it has very tall cliffs and steep inclines, except for a small area that connects to the hill behind it. A couple of kilometers north of this is the great ancient rock known as Sela. It was a formidable defensive location. Look carefully at the photo of Sela. It's taken from several miles away. Look at the very large flat-top mountain, and it's been divided from the rocks, from the hills behind it, and so there's no way up except up a narrow stairway. The structure in the middle of this picture is actually a great water system that was used for storing water, and also if an army wanted to push their way up the stairs, a wall of water and floating debris could be released and sweep them away. This is Sela. This is the first great rock that was used by the Nabateans. It had one main stairway to the top, and it had defensive positions and storerooms, and also had several high place altars. Here is one high place on Sela, looking out towards the Dead Sea. And here is another high place altar. On the side of the great rock of Sela, there is a monument to King Nabonidus, the Neo-Babylonian king who managed to take this fortress around 500 BC. He carved a memorial into the side of the mountain, very high up on the side of the mountain. Here is that memorial monument, and a team of archaeologists and climbers have gone down to check it out. This is in May 2018, led by a Spanish professor. Now, Sela is a relatively small place, some 60 kilometers north of Petra. Since Petra is larger, there are more high places around Petra. Let's go to Petra. And now you can see the most famous high place, the one you climb up the stairs that are just past the theater. And you go up about 900 steps to the top of this mountain. Along the way, you will see two large obelisks. These are carved out of solid rock, and many different and varied suggestions have been made of why they're there. But you can look at them, and other people will make suggestions. Along the way, you'll see an old Crusader castle. What's unfortunate about this is that the Crusaders took away most of the building blocks from the other structures that were on the mountain. So the earlier buildings are completely lost to us. At the top of the mountain, there is the altar area, and it has several different features. First, in front of the altar is a flat square area, sort of cut down into the mountain, and it has a small raised area in the middle. We have no idea what was there. The rocks have been taken away. Perhaps this is where an idol stood. Some have suggested that maybe some sort of astronomical device stood there for measuring the stars. Whatever it was, everything has been removed. On the back side of the flat area are the two altars. One is for killing the sacrificial animal and draining its blood, and the other altar is for burning the sacrificial animal. There are a couple of things to notice here. First, the main altar was used for burning of the animal. It has two steps leading up to it and an area cut out at the top of the altar to hold the red hot coals. To the left of the main altar is another place where an animal was killed. This is the blood altar. Notice the small cistern cut in the side so water is available for washing. And perhaps the priest washed his hands there. Perhaps the sacrifice was washed. We're not sure. Second, notice that at the center of the blood altar, there's a small groove that was cut so the blood could be caught and drained away. Now, some 40 years ago, that's a long time, I was there with some young men, and we tried to rappel down the face of the cliff to see where this small rock-cut channel led to. The channel's very old and it's very worn in places, but it appears that the blood channel mixed with a water channel for rainwater, and these channels came together down the mountain to where an old monument stood. Now, it's in the form of a lion, but zealous people smashed off the face of the monument, and as they did to all the visible images in Petra. This was probably done during the reign of Caliph Yazid long ago. Now, you can imagine the surprise people would get when the water pouring out of the mouth of the lion turned into blood. Did enough animals have to be killed and their blood drained until the blood reached the mouth of the lion? Or was it mixed with water? We don't know. But what did it signify? Did it signify the sacrifice had been accepted? No records are left. As I've studied ancient history in the Middle East, and as I've visited many religious sites, I've been struck by the number of ancient altars that are all over the Middle East. These are altars in temples and altars on mountaintops. There were altars built on walls and at the end of streets in cities. There were even altars in homes used by people in their homes. And the writings of the prophets mention the building of many other altars. In each case, something is offered on the altar. Sometimes incense was burned on a small altar. Sometimes food was left. In the instance of a larger altar, an animal was killed, and the blood was handled usually differently than the animal carcass. Sometimes the best parts of the animal might be eaten by the priest, but in general the animal was burned. This is what is generally called a burnt offering. This is mentioned especially in the writings of the prophets. Here is the earliest copy of the book of Leviticus, or the third book of Moses. And this is where Moses taught that blood should be treated separately and specially. Moses tells us that the life is in the blood. Sometimes there was a special place to offer the blood, and sometimes it was sprinkled on the main altar before the animal was burned. Sometimes, as we just saw, the blood was drained away in a special way and treated with special reverence. Now the prophet Moses gave very special instruction on how the Israelite people were to perform sacrifices. Long before Moses, the prophet Abraham, or Ibrahim, he built altars and he performed sacrifices. And before Abraham, Noah did it. And before Noah, Adam did it, and so did his children. If you read Jewish and Christian scripture, sacrifice was always practiced. It was done in a special way. In Jewish and Christian literature, blood was always shed. While there are instances of offerings of grain mixed with incense, the emphasis is always on the killing of an animal and the shedding of its blood. Now, sometimes the incense was burned while the animal was being burned as well, and the main offering was taking place, but the focus seemed to be always on the killing of an animal and the shedding of its blood. King David built altars, and he offered animals on it, and the records tell us that Solomon also built altars and offered sacrifices. In fact, the ancient Israel, the entire nation, there was at the temple, an animal was killed every day, sometimes twice a day, at the morning and at the evening sacrifice. So over 700 animals a year were sacrificed as part of the daily offering in the temple. All of the prophets participated in sacrifice, and many of them spoke about sacrifice. The concept of blood sacrifice was at the core of almost all ancient religions. Even the pagans copied what the prophets taught. While they worshipped different gods and sometimes multiple gods, the core of their worship focused on the shedding of blood. From Adam to Cain and Abel, we have records there, to Noah, all the way to Moses, and to Abraham first, and then to Moses, and so forth. Now, why did an animal have to be killed? This has to do with the idea of substitutionary death. Now, this is how the thinking goes. As a race, a human race, all humans have dishonored God. We cannot come into the presence of God in this state. He's hidden himself from us. We hear from God through messengers because of the way God has barred the way for coming to him. Christians say there's a great chasm between us and God. The Quran describes it as a great boundary between us and God, marked with a lot tree, or Sidrat al-Muntaha. This marks the end of the seventh heaven. So there is no way to pass beyond that tree. Eternal separation from God. This is what is taught by these ancient religions. This can also be expressed in more legal terminology. Well, that terminology says all of us are guilty before God. All of us have done things that we were told not to do, and we are guilty before God, and judgment has been passed. We are forever cast out of his presence. This is what the prophet Moses told us in the book of Genesis. We have been separated from God, not just Adam and Eve, but all of mankind. Another way to express this is that we do not all have the power to get into God's presence. He's all-powerful. Nothing we can do, nothing we can say can bring us into the presence of God. We are helpless and hopelessly cast out, unless somehow that shame has got to be removed. Somehow that guilt has got to be paid for. Somehow power needs to be given to us to come into God's presence. And all that can be done through substitutionary death. That's the concept behind substitutionary death. It's that we must somehow pay for the shame we have brought. We must somehow pay for the guilt we bear. But since we are shameful and guiltful, full of guilt, we cannot pay our own problems. Nothing we do is good enough. We're forever separated from God. The only way is for something else, something beyond us, something bigger than us, or beyond who we are, to pay for the shame that caused the separation, pay for the guilt that was on us. All over the world, all down through history, the principle has been the same. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission or pardon or deliverance or liberty or forgiveness. That is why we find altars in all of these temples and on top of these mountains and in every valley and in individual homes. That is why it was a very important part of ancient life. Now, the concept of sacrifice is not very strong in the Quran. It tells us that God commanded Moses to have the people kill a cow and offer it as a sacrifice. There is also the story of the two sons of Adam who sacrificed an animal. One was accepted and one was not. Moses tells us the rest of the story, that God accepted the one with the blood sacrifice, while the other tried to offer and sacrifice vegetables and things grown in his garden, and he was not accepted. The Quran also tells us to pray to God alone and to sacrifice to him. But there's no single good word used for sacrifice in the Quran. The same word could mean to give your offering to him. It could also mean, it comes from the idea of butchering an animal. So some claim maybe this has to do with halal, and you should offer your animals to God and make sure you face the right place when you offer the animal. The other interesting thing is that the Quran never mentions the word blood. So while all of the prophets speak of blood sacrifice, and while they all practiced it, it is not spoken about in the Quran. Now, what about Christians? If you ask any real Christians, those who understand their faith and who have studied it or fully understand it, not just somebody who has the name, if you ask them about blood and sacrifice, they'll get all excited and they'll tell you things that this is the very core of Christianity. You see, they, and myself included, we believe that one sacrifice was made that answered to the need for blood sacrifice. No single human being could offer enough to redeem himself, let alone his friend or his neighbor. That is why they look to the death of Jesus as the ultimate blood sacrifice. A person who was sinless, and he had done nothing wrong, he did not bear any shame or any guilt before God, and yet his blood was shed, not because God was weak, but because God allowed it. His blood provided for us. So when a Christian dies, he faces God. He will not claim Jesus as his prophet. No, he will claim the blood of Jesus shed on the cross as sufficient payment for the shame and for the guilt that he bears before God. That is why Christians no longer offer sacrifices. There's no need, because the ultimate sacrifice has been given, and followers of Jesus have the right to claim his blood as a substitute for the shame and the guilt that they bear before God. I hope this helps you understand why altars and blood sacrifice are so important to the prophets, from Adam all the way up to Yahya, and why Christians no longer offer blood sacrifices. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series Archaeology and Islam.